Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Prabhupada Jaya, Prabhupada Jaya. Jaya Vishnu Bhagavan Maharaji Jaya, Sadasi Swadesi, Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jaya, Namacharya Haridas Thakur Ki Jaya. Prem Sagaha Sri Krishna Chaitanya, Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar, Shasdi Gaur Bhaktivinoda Ki Jaya. Shri Sri Radha Krishna Gopika Gopika Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhana Ki Jai, Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai, Navadvip Dham Ki Jai, Ganga Jamuna Tulsi Bhakti Devi Ki Jai, Ananda Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai, Samaveta Bhakti Vrinda Ki Jai, Go Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga, all glories to Srila Prabhupada. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 17, Verse 18. Navayam klesha bijani yatasyu purushashabha purusham tam bijanimo avakya bheda vimohita. Translation: O greatest among human beings, it is very difficult to ascertain the particular miscreant who has caused our sufferings, because we are bewildered by all the different opinions of theoretical philosophers. Purport: there are many theoretical philosophers in the world who put forward their own theories of cause and effect, especially about the cause of the suffering and its effect on different living beings. Generally, there are 6 great philosophers: Kanada, author of Vaisheshika philosophy; Gautama, author of logic; Patanjali, author of mystic yoga; Kapila, author of Sankhya philosophy; Jaimini, author of Karma Mimamsa; and Vyasadeva, author of Vedanta Darshan. Although the bull, or the personality of religion, and the cow, personality of the earth, knew perfectly well that the personality of Kali was the direct cause of their sufferings, still, as devotees of the Lord, they knew well also that without the sanction of the Lord, no one can inflict trouble upon them. According to the Padma Purana, our present trouble is due to the fructifying of seedling sins. But even the seedling sins also gradually fade away by execution of pure devotional service. Thus, even if the devotees see the mischief mongers, they do not accuse them for the suffering inflicted. They take it for granted that the mischief monger is made to act by some indirect cause, and therefore they tolerate the sufferings, thinking them to be God-given in small doses, for otherwise the suffering should have been greater. Maharaj Parikshit wanted to get a statement of accusation against the direct mischief monger, but they declined to give it on the above-mentioned grounds. Speculative philosophers, however, do not recognize the sanction of the Lord. They try to find out the cause of sufferings in their own way, as will be described in the following verses. According to Srila Jiva Goswami, such speculators are themselves bewildered, and thus they cannot know that the ultimate cause of all causes is the Supreme Lord, the personality of Godhead. Translation: O greatest among human beings, it is very difficult to ascertain the particular miscreant who has caused our sufferings, because we are bewildered by all the different opinions of theoretical philosophers. In response to Maharaj Parikshit's inquiry about who is the cause of their suffering, we see here that the bull gives a very philosophical answer. We can observe things in this world and find out a direct cause of things. One thing is caused by another. And nevertheless, there's always a cause of that cause, an indirect cause of that, etc. So, this leads to all sorts of philosophical speculation. We have the question, why do we suffer in this world? And then we'll get all sorts of answers for that. So that is a perplexing question, and we see even in the modern day, people will ask the same question. In ancient times, we find that some people tried not to speculate on their own, so they took the authority of the Vedic literature. Well, that's a good point. Other persons made their own theories independent of the Vedas, or rejected the Vedas and made their own theories. And thus we have other religious groups like Buddhists and Jains in India, and then we have around the world different religions. So they don't refer at all to the Vedic literature. So this group mentioned here by Prabhupada in the purport, who form what we call the Shaddarshanas, or 6 philosophical branches. They at least accept the Vedas, so there is some similarity in some of what they say or what they conclude. Nevertheless, most of it also is speculation. So though they accept the Vedas, they come to the wrong conclusion, and therefore it's rejectable. This is surprising, of course, because they do follow the Vedas, but they often misinterpret the Vedas by using the Vedas to support their own ideas. We often see, even in ISKCON, people will make a statement and they'll support that statement by quoting this and quoting that. Another person will counter that and he will make an opposite statement and he will quote other things. And so this is where we get big arguments taking place, people quoting here and quoting there. So we can always use quotes one way or the other to support something that we believe in. But we also have to be very careful that we see the context of the quotations and understand the real meaning of them before we start quoting them. Often people, even in ancient times, they use the Vedic literature and its statements to support their ideas, even though the final conclusion of the Vedas is something quite different. So therefore we get these conclusions which are very, we say, surprising. We have here the Sankhya philosophy of atheistic Kapila, and he will quote Vedic literature and whatever, and part of it is true. This idea of Sankhya we also incorporate in our Bhagavat philosophy in like 3rd canto, where there's a discussion of the elements such as earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, false ego, prakriti, all that. Okay. So we also take the same thing, and he takes that also from Vedic literature. But then his conclusion is that we also have the Atma, or the Jiva. So we have prakriti with all of its transformations into material elements, and we have Jiva. And that's it. There's no Supreme Lord in his philosophy. Somehow he's able to avoid all those quotations that talk about Ishvara and Parameshvara and Vishnu. And he'll just say, okay, there's Jiva, Supreme Lord. Finished. And whole goal is Jiva gets out of Prakriti, and that's it. So that's taking Vedic philosophy, comes to that conclusion. Jaimini, a very famous Karma Mimamsa philosophy. This produces a very, we say, strong movement in India. People who followed this philosophy of doing sacrifices to go to Svarga Loka. And in this philosophy also they recognize worship of devatas, etc. They recognize reincarnation, soul going to body after body, etc. But it is not necessary to worship a Supreme Lord at all in that philosophy. Again, it's atheistic, like Kapila's philosophy. So definitely in the Vedic literature there is encouragement to do yagyas or sacrifices and promotion to heavenly planets, but that's not the ultimate goal. But that's what Jaimini does. He makes elevation to Svarga the ultimate goal. So in this way we find another philosophy which is based on the Vedas but gives a very strange conclusion. The other philosophies, to some degree, will accept a kind of a supreme lord or supreme something, like Gautama and Kanada and Patanjali. Okay, they'll accept some sort of Ishvara of sorts, but at best it is impersonal, doesn't do anything. So we have a Jiva, Prakriti, and some sort of Ishvara that doesn't do anything. And again, the whole process is liberation. Just get liberation in impersonal Brahman, basically. Yeah? And even if we take Vedanta, based upon Upanishads and Vedanta Sutras of Vyasadeva, we get different sages who will interpret Vedanta Sutra of Veda Vyas. And again, we will end up with a strange conclusion. So we have Shankara's conclusion that only the Supreme exists, and matter and jivas don't exist. They're all illusory. So we don't need the other philosophies here. They accept jiva, they accept prakriti at least. Shankaracharya doesn't accept that at all. No jiva, no prakriti. It's all illusory. Only Brahman exists. And he gets that from Vedanta Sutra and Shankaracharya. So if we take the Vaishnavas, they take Vedanta Sutra, and then we get the conclusion which is the same as the Bhagavatam. As is often said, the Bhagavatam is the commentary, natural commentary on the Vedanta Sutras or the Brahma Sutras, which means that Vedavyas wrote both. He wrote Vedanta Sutra, he also wrote Srimad Bhagavatam as the natural commentary on the sutra. So, if we look in Bhagavatam, and we see Bhagavan is supreme, and Brahman is a secondary aspect. Brahman, Paramama, Bhagavan. Of all these philosophies, we take the Vaishnava interpretation of Vedanta as the conclusion of everything. And that is what is represented in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So the bull here is saying, well, it's very difficult to figure out what's what and to analyze the cause of our suffering because we've got all these different opinions, philosophical opinions, Vakya Veda, which cause confusion to us. So how can we understand what is the cause of our suffering? And of course, all of these philosophies deal with suffering. We say that the purpose of philosophy is to solve the problem of suffering. Why do we suffer in this world? So most of these philosophies will say we separate the jiva from prakriti, and that's the conclusion. Or in Shankar's terms, we just get rid of the jiva and merge them in Brahman. So that's how we get rid of suffering. But then they have all sorts of arguments to support their particular process for doing that. So Gautama says use logic. Patanjali says use yoga process. So we have all of these different opinions. And as I said, the ultimate conclusion is the Vaishnava interpretation of Vedanta, and that is represented by the Srimad Bhagavatam. So we have this in the Bhagavat philosophy. How do we explain suffering? As I said, that suffering is a major problem that has to be explained in all religions. And if it is not explained sufficiently, it causes a lack of faith. And we see that in different people. We are suffering. Why do we suffer? If there's a God, why does he permit our suffering? And if he permits our suffering, then he must be a cruel God. So how can we believe in a cruel God? So this is a doubt that arises, and because of this doubt, with no good answer from different religions, they will reject religions, and they will reject God. So we have to have a good explanation for the suffering that takes place in the world. So, of course, all of these philosophies, to some degree, give the correct answer, because most of them believe in a soul. We can say they all believe in a soul of some sort. And the soul bound up in Prakriti is the cause of the suffering. It's the ultimate cause. In this case, the Kali is attacking the bull, but that's the immediate cause. But behind that, why we have material bodies, that's the cause. And we have to understand a subtle cause. So all of these different philosophies will accept at least that there is the jiva bound up in a material body, and then the jiva does activities, he creates karma, and the karma creates his suffering. So this is more or less agreeable from all these philosophies, saddarshanas. But the question will be, why does this take place? Why the jiva has to be stuck in Prakriti at all? So that also can be answered, and we have an answer in the philosophy of the Bhagavatam. So the jivas are stuck in Prakriti. Why? Because they are ignorant. They identify themselves with the material body, and they think themselves an enjoyer. Then they do activities, then they get karma. So this is the the philosophical answer as the cause of our suffering. But then the question will arise, well, still the Lord, what does the Lord do? Then he permits all this to happen. So therefore, he's a cruel Lord, because he permits us to suffer, and he creates a system by which we suffer in the material world. So why does the Lord do that? So even if we do have a law of karma operating, we do have the Supreme Lord involved. However, we can see that the suffering is not the Lord's creation. The suffering is actually the suffering created by the jiva. He does activities, and he's responsible for that, and therefore he gets the result in terms of suffering. So therefore the suffering is not caused by the Lord, it's caused by the jiva. So that helps to solve the problem, and if we accept the law of karma and the idea of rebirth, then we can solve part of that problem, which is not available in some religions because they don't accept taking another body or the law of karma, so then there's a problem for them. But for those who accept the soul taking body after body, then it's no problem. Still, then the question is there for the more philosophical person. Then, well, then why is that jiva? Why is he stuck in the material world like that? So, different philosophers give different answers, and even different Vaishnavas will probably give different answers. But if we look at it broadly, the Vaishnavas will say, yes, jivas in the material world are suffering, but they don't have to suffer. And we have nityasiddhas, jivas who are eternally in the spiritual world that never suffer. So it's not that the jiva has to suffer, but he suffers by choice. If he doesn't accept the Lord, then he accepts the suffering of the material world. If he accepts the Lord, then no suffering in the material world. There's happiness in the spiritual world. So we have the jivas in the spiritual world and jivas in the material world. So we say, we call the jiva tatastha shakti, or the borderline shakti, which means the jiva can be influenced by ignorance, take up a material body, or he can also get out of ignorance, and then he can be in the spiritual world with a spiritual body, where there's no karma and no ignorance, and there's full bliss. So it comes down to why some jivas in the material. It is because jiva by nature is tatashta. He can go either way. So in the Paramatma Sandarbha, Jiva Goswami describes how Paramatma is there as Mahavishnu. And then the Tatastha Shakti emanates from Paramatma, and the Tatastha Shakti manifests all the jivas. And then they have this propensity: either they like to be in ignorance and they sit in the material world, and Mahavishnu creates material worlds and sticks the jivas in there, or the others are eternally in the spiritual world. So the jivas are they have a choice, and they can reverse the choice if they're in the material world. If they decide they don't like the material world and they want to recognize the Lord, yes, then they can get out. They go to the spiritual world. So the whole purpose of Scripture is to encourage the jiva to do this, to go from the material world to the spiritual world. And there's a halfway point. That is just getting liberation. So by practice of jnana or sankhya or these other philosophies, you can get liberated from the material world. You don't quite make it to the spiritual world in full. You get out of the material world. So you end up back in a borderline position. So it's not complete. So if we want to get the complete process to go to the spiritual world, then we have to do bhakti yoga. And this will take us from material world to spiritual world. So in this way, the jiva, the whole problem of suffering originates with the jiva and his nature. And the nature of some jivas is to sit in the material world and try to enjoy it. And they also have to suffer as a result. This first line here mentions the word klesha, bija, the seed of suffering. And so this, of course, the seed of suffering is our karma. Suffering means things happen to our body that we don't like, painful things, or to our mind or whatever. How does it arise? It has a cause, a bija, a seed. So what is the seed of that suffering? It is karma, which means that we do sinful activities previously, which lead to suffering in the future. So that suffering does not manifest immediately. It may manifest many lifetimes later. So it's like a little plant that grows up, and finally, when it's mature, it says suffering, and we get our suffering. So it starts with a little seed, and it goes up. So what is the seed, finally, of everything? It's ultimately our desires. We have desires to enjoy in certain ways. This causes us to do activities, and then the activities give karma in the future life in terms of suffering. And even then, that as I said, the suffering gradually matures over many lifetimes, and then eventually it turns into a fruit. That is, we suffer in the body. That desire, where does the desire come from? A desire to enjoy. And the analysis of the Scripture is ignorance. Ignorance causes desire. So what does that mean? Sounds very philosophical. So what it means is, if we reject the Supreme Lord, that we are the servant of the Supreme Lord, then immediately all we can do is act on our own, for ourselves. So then we develop desires. I have to do this to become happy in this world. So the material desires are a result of our independent nature, to act independently. So that is what ignorance is. So that's the ultimate seed of all of the suffering in the material world. Ignorance, leading to desire, leading to activity, leading to karma, finally leading to suffering. So if we want to get rid of the suffering, then we should go back and get rid of the final seed. Get rid of the ignorance. How do we do that? Knowledge. So what do? Recognize, I am the servant of Krishna. And this is the seed of getting rid of the karma, all the karma. So, I am the servant of Krishna. This is the basis of bhakti. We have faith that there's a Supreme Lord, I am His servant. And then we accept all the conclusions of the bhakti scriptures. And then we do bhakti yoga. So this is the primary method of getting rid of the suffering in the material world. Take it all the way back to the very cause, ignorance, and reverse that by knowledge that we are the servant of Krishna, and secondly by action to support that. That's the bhakti yoga. This will destroy the suffering completely. So these philosophies don't get that far. These other philosophies, they go a little partial up maybe to liberation. They get you out of the material world, and they get you to the out. So destroy the suffering, but they don't give the bliss of the spiritual world. So in that sense, incomplete. So the Vaishnava Vedanta, this is what gets us out of the material world and takes us to the Supreme Lord. Gaudiya Vaishnava Vedanta, which is, you can say, is a subcategory of Vaishnava Vedanta, takes Krishna as the ultimate form of Bhagavan. Krishna, then not only we get out of the material world, destroy the ignorance, and get a spiritual body, but we get the highest bliss available in the spiritual world. So that's the speciality of the followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. We get a form of bliss which is very intense, more than the other forms in the spiritual world. So that's the unique feature of Bhagavatam also, to say everybody should worship Krishna. Okay, any question?
Thank you, Madam. My question is about, we use the simple answer that throughout independence and determination we become conditioned to fall in. But it seems like the association is always there's other factors to make a decision just around independence.
Oh, yeah.
So it seems like we're all living entities and they're all equal, and there's some entities get influenced in a particular way that falls in the material world.
Mm-hmm.
That would seem unfair, that in a sense.
Yeah.
People are the same. Yeah. So just a level playing field, so to speak.
Yeah. If we're animals, then it doesn't really matter. It just goes, you automatically progress very slowly upwards. And your actions don't give any result. In other words, the tiger kills an animal, he doesn't get any karma for that. When we come to the human being stage, then we're responsible for our actions. Even there, it's exceptional. If you're a small child, then you're not responsible because your mind isn't developed enough. So when you're an adult, then you should. Even then, we got exceptions. If you're mentally impaired, then of course, then they make exception to that also. But anyway, the adult is more or less responsible. But we know that, of course, even human beings, very difficult for them to make proper decisions. Very, very difficult. That's why in the Varnashram system, they aid the person by limiting their choices. And particularly the Sudras, who are the majority of the human population, limit their choice. Don't allow them to choose anything. Don't give them any money so they can't buy all sorts of things. You give them their maintenance, you give them their food, you give them their shelter. You make sure that they're raising their family properly. Okay, they're satisfied with that. Good. So they limit their choice. Still, they got within their family, they have choices to make there also, how to relate with their family members like that. So there's choice there, and there was at least that much they're responsible for. But broad choices, maybe they're not given so much because they're not really capable of doing that. But when we get to the upper classes, yeah, then they got that freedom. Vaishyas, Kshatriyas, and Brahmanas, then they're really, they have to be very careful. Added to that, of course, then we get the guidance of Scripture. So if we do have a Varnashram Scripture, then the laws are set up. This is, you can do this, but you can't do this, and if you can't do this, and you do it, then you get punished. So there's a little impetus there. Don't do it because you get punished. And we don't want punishment, so therefore we won't do it. So therefore the choice again is more or less encouraged to make a certain choice rather than that. So we have laws to help you also choose. So finally, of course, we have the scripture, and that helps us. And as we go up in the system, the people have deeper understanding of the laws of what is right and wrong, of scripture, etc. So that's the kshatriya and the brahmana. So they can enforce this on the rest of the population properly. So in that way, gradually these jivas in the bottom, the human beings in the bottom rungs, over many lifetimes they get purified, and then they can work their way up, and then they become more independent and make their own choices freely. So yeah, they don't have complete freedom, so therefore there's a system to help them. If we don't have that system, then it's very difficult. There's just haphazard, people make all sorts of decisions. Now, you talked about association, so yes, very important. So that is why, of course, in Varnashram system they do have, your association is very limited also. And we know that good association makes a good person, and bad association makes a bad person. So everyone tries to choose good association as much as possible. And that was also encouraged within the Varnashram system by minimizing crime and, unqualified people, keep them out of the system completely. And then we have the case of the Vaishnava. The Vaishnava gives his association, and then immediately people can start changing and go beyond these the gunas and their karma, etc., by devotional service. So in other words, they can surpass the limits of the Varnashram system also by getting mercy of Vaishnavas and performing bhakti. So this is a way in which the jiva can get use his independence in the best possible way and get out of the whole system.
So that was the ego perspective from the jiva in the material world. The question is also about the jiva in the spiritual world. How does the liberated living entity that has knowledge, does not have by ignorance at all, can become so degraded, and what's the cause? Because we're all in a similar situation in the spiritual world.
So if a jiva is in the spiritual world is nityasiddha, then nothing can happen. He cannot fall. It is a nityasiddha. And the jivas from the material world, if they go to the spiritual world, that jiva has, of course, this nature. But then when we get to the stage of bhava and prema, the sarup shakti of Krishna, the chit shakti, or the sarup shakti, or the internal energy, joins with the jiva. And then in prema that becomes a permanent asset. So he's not exactly like the jiva in the material world anymore. He's a little bit different. He's got this chit shakti in him. And this is the guarantee that he stays in the spiritual world like the nityasiddhas. And he doesn't fall.
So that means we never had that position.
Well, in one sense, we can say from like in Bhaktivinoda Thakur when he talks about the fall of the jiva, etc. And then in another place then he talks about, the jiva's in the middle and he makes a choice this way and that way. But then we can say, well, when did the choice take place, at a theoretical point in time? So it appears to be more or less just an image or a metaphor that he's using to say that the jiva does have independence, but we don't put a time when he made a choice one way or the other. So therefore we just have the jivas stuck in the material world and those in the spiritual world, and then the jiva from the material world goes to the spiritual world. But nevertheless he also talks about, okay, the jiva at a certain point chooses the material world, but it seems to be more or less metaphorical. And then he also says, well, actually from our point of view in the material world, because we're conditioned by material time and space, we cannot really understand the jiva when he's out of time and space in the spiritual world. So we can't really explain it from our point of view, but because that position in the spiritual world is completely different from this. So to try to analyze everything from our point of view in terms of time and space doesn't really make sense. So therefore, only when you're in the spiritual world, then you'll understand why you're there or why you were here or whatever.
So we understand jiva Now, we understand that jiva is in the material world due to the ignorance, etc. The suffering is created, the jiva is creating his own suffering. One who takes up devotional service, you understand that Krishna takes charge of his life, but still it seems that devotees can suffer in ways. So where is that suffering coming from?
Well, there's various things. One is, of course, that bhakti destroys karma and suffering, etc. Klesha agni is the first thing in devotional service. In some cases, it's a very gradual process. So we go through anartha vritti, nishta ruchi, asakti, and bhava, like that. So the karmas are gone at the end of a shakti completely. So before that, you would have some karmas to deal with, because we have billions and billions and billions of karmas. So they're all getting destroyed. Some are prarabdha, some are aparabdha, etc. So they're getting destroyed gradually. That's one answer. And the other is that gradual process becomes more gradual if there is some aparad in this life or previous lifetimes that'll slow the process. So we get distinct stages like anartha vritti and then nishta and ruchi because of that. The other way of looking at it is that, as in the case of Ajamil, all of his karmas were destroyed when he uttered the name Narayana first. But it appeared that nothing changed, because he was doing the same activities, same similar activities up until his death. And he didn't even know anything was changed. And it's only when the Yamadutas came to get him he understood he didn't have any karma. So something had changed, but it didn't look like it had changed. So then what happened? Vishnu Chakravarti explains that, yes, all the karmas were destroyed. We have to accept the scriptural statement, and we have the witness of the Vishnu Dutas and the Yamadutas there to say there was no karma there. But why that state? It looked like there was karma. And he kept committing sinful activities after that also, even. So the answer is that the Vishnu Chakravarti gives is that sometimes the holy name and bhakti, they hide their glory, their power, so that there's an appearance of karma, then it looks like nothing has changed. And it goes on as normal. So there's an appearance that when actually, if you're to take the person and examine him with Yamaraj, then Yamaraj will say no karma. But it looks like there's karma as far as we can see, because it seems to be continuing. So there's an appearance of karma for those individuals, even if the karma is gone.
So the karma's gone, but still somehow or other
some pattern is there.
Propensity or bad habits still remain to some degree.
Oh, well, that's the other thing, is that if there's some aparad in the past, or even if there isn't, this is maybe a slow process, and one after the other karmas get removed, so there's still a few karmas remaining. Yeah. Of course, here Prabhupada explains they're getting it in small doses, he says here. So it's not in the full amount, it's in smaller doses, they're still getting some of the effect.
In Srimad Bhagavatam, 4th canto,
in Srimad Bhagavatam, 4th canto, it's the talks between. It's the chapter where Arjuna becomes a woman in the next slide. And this is text 53. The Brahman says, my dear friend, even though you do not immediately recognize me, can't you remember that in the past you had a very intimate friend? Unfortunately, you gave up on Brahman, accepted a position as an employer of this material world. And you know about mentions. When the living entity's desire to enjoy himself, develop consciousness, duality, come to hate the service of the Lord, in this way the living entities fall into the material world. In Prema Vibhaka, it is said, the natural position of the living entities is to serve the Lord in transcendental loving attitude. When the living entity wants to become Krishna himself, or imitate Krishna, he falls down into the material world. So it seems like, would you say that's grand conclusive about how we came in the first place?
Yeah, but as I said, even like Bhaktivinoda Thakur talks like that also, and he says the Nitya Dharma of the Jiva is prema. But then if it's eternal, how come we don't have it now? There's no prema here. So then he says that, of course, then we're in a fallen state, etc. But then how do we get to that fallen state? That's the whole problem. So then finally he answers that you could not really understand our position here just by analyzing in terms of, time and place, etc., of our limited logic. The only way you really understand the reason for being in the material world is when you're in the spiritual world, where you're beyond time. Then you can actually understand it in detail. So he says at a certain point we cannot discuss any further.
In the text, not in Prabhupada's paper, in the text it does say, you gave up my company. I was your intimate friend, isn't it? That's the nature of world. Yeah,
so that's described by, I think, our acharyas in some places, that you go into Mahavishnu and you come out of Mahavishnu again and again.
So you mean that verse?
Was that Paramatma form, yeah.
Paramatma form.
Yeah. That's how it's explained, I think, by Vishwanath anyway, and maybe Sridhar Swami also.
So then that precise verse was explained by
Yeah.
Swami
Yeah.
and Vishwanath
Yeah.
that both has
That's Vishnu.
being separated from Paramatma.
Because we go Mahavishnu, and we sit there, and then we come out, and we go into the material world, and then we go back into it, and come out again, and go back into him. So we're with him at one time, and then we separate, and we forget him completely.
And it says as an intimate friend, and in that stage where...
Well, he's always intimate, even now.
The soul is merged into the body of Mahavishnu. They're not, they just are hibernation. They just have a relation.
Well, intimate in that sense, he's within him, very intimate. And of course, the Supreme Lord is always the well-wisher of the living entity. He's never indifferent to him. He's always, his best friend and intimate with him. But at the same time, that he gives the jiva his free will, and then he does things in this material world.
And also when you mentioned about Ajamil as after the event about the Yamanitas, Vishnudutas, what I was reading in the Bhagavatam is that actually he realized how sinner he was, and he was in the prayer, how I gave up my virtuous wife and I was with this prostitute. So my understanding from the verse that I read in the Bhagavatam about Ajamil is that after that event that he called Narayana and the Yamanitas and Vishnudutas, that he started having a palace life again. That was my understanding.
Well, afterwards he came back to life, and then he became a devotee.
Oh, because you said that he kept being a sinner.
Well, up until his death.
But he didn't die there.
Yeah, but then he came. Well, then he had he saw Yamaraj and the Vishnu Dutas. Then he came back to life. Then he became a devotee. But up until the point of his death, he was doing sinful activities still. No.
So he was doing sinful activities until that event.
Yeah, until his death. It's almost his near-death experience. Until his near-death experience. Then he came back and he became a devotee. Okay, Hare Krishna.